Friends, welcome. It is 12:30. I hope you had a chance to catch your breath, maybe stretch a little bit, prepare yourself for workshop number one and today's second day of our seminar. We are happy to invite one of our colleagues across the border, Chris, who is a connection through us to Carla. I've never had a chance to personally be a part of Chris' workshop, but we had some previous participants who went to be a part of his conversation around or teaching around theory of change. So we definitely want to make space for this conversation today. You probably have already read his bio, whether it was on Hoover or before when we sent out bios earlier. If he chooses to share more about himself, he can. I just want to let you know I'll be monitoring the chat if any questions arise, any needs arise. I'll also place in the chat my email as well as the link to our application process for those of you who may be considering being a part of our 2022 cohort. But with the email invitation, know that it's not just about, are your cohort ready? Or if not, there's no need to be in conversation. Some of you all just may want to talk about some ideas, need a conversation partner, and we always stand ready to imagine together and even hold space for people who need to be able to vent as they are thinking through what it means to live in the change and those sometimes challenges and consequences that come with being change agents in your community. So I'll now turn things over to Chris. And again, I'll place that information in the chat shortly. Thanks, Chris, for joining us today.
I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for having me. Yep, my name's Chris. You're here to learn about theory of change, which means, or if you are, then you probably know a little bit about it, and I'll go into more detail. The other side of it is how do you start change or grow your nonprofit program? Because the theory of change is, well, I wouldn't say necessary, is a boon if you're looking to do any of those things. So what impact are you having? How do you know? What difference is your program making? These are questions that we've all been asked and that are familiar to us, and we ask them ourselves all the time. We can have a greater impact if we think strategically about our desired impact while planning, implementing, and evaluating our programs. And that's what the theory of change is about. So the talk that I'll do for the next hour will help you break your program down into its component parts, differentiating between things like what do we do versus what do we achieve. And a theory of change will provide you with a roadmap that outlines the steps by which you plan to achieve your goals, which essentially your mission, right? Is the story of how you believe your program's change will unfold. A theory of change can aid in aligning your stakeholders to your larger mission and help them understand their role in achieving it. So Darnell was kind enough to say I can talk a bit about myself. I'm not really going to do that. I'm more interested in talking to you about the theory of change and the real work that you're doing. One thing I would love for you guys to do as attendees, some of when I go through this, I riff a bit, I might make examples. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, just your name, well, your name will pop up. So I guess your role in your organization, it would allow me to put some context to what we discuss. I'd love for you guys to participate in the chat. I mean, you'll be muted for most of the talk, but you can ask questions in the chat box at any time, and I welcome you to do that. I also do a fair amount of teaching, and these days it's been through Zoom, so I'm comfortable reading your questions while I'm still delivering the presentation. I'm not going to find it a distraction, quite the opposite. And then I'll also address any questions, not just throughout the webinar, but at the end. Yeah, I do want to mention, if we do get into specific discussions, please only disclose information from this workshop after receiving authorization from the owner to do so. So if somebody says something else and that's something of value to you, it's probably best you connect them. Basically protecting, I don't have to tell you guys about the importance of protecting confidential information. It's essential to the work that we do. And the duty of confidentiality is both an ethical, legal, and professional duty for all of us, right? So I do welcome you to reflect on your organization as we go through this. And if you've got a pen and paper or an open document in front of you, I welcome you to try and quickly sketch out a really, really high level idea of your theory of change for your organization, because that may make this something that the material might be something that you connect to better. Nice to meet you, Amanda. Thanks for the introduction. I welcome the rest of you if you'd like to do the same. I also wouldn't mind knowing, is there a general familiarity with logic models among those of you that are on the call? I'm gonna, unless I hear otherwise, I'll move forward, assuming not. The agenda for today, I'll quickly differentiate how a theory of change is different from a logic model. They both come from around the 50s, and they're very similar but different. The bulk of the talk will be about theory of change, but if we have time at the end, and we may not, I'll also talk about logic models a bit. This is normally the last time that I offered this for McMaster. This was a 3-hour talk. So I'm going to jump right into it because we're doing our best to fit this into 1 hour. So the term theory of change and logic model are sometimes used interchangeably. Both concepts are very closely connected, not just in their origin, but in how they're used. And they often blend into each other. But for those of us that are leading programs, the distinction between these two is really important. A theory of change includes the big, messy picture that we're used to, right? It's centered on the change that we want to identify. It will address, some of the assumptions that we've made and underlying factors which are not part of our model but exist and impact it. Whereas a logic model presents an orderly plan for your specific mission and tends to be more focused on the activities rather than the outcomes. A logic model is still useful in regards to a theory of change and is often used as a lens to concentrate on a specific pathway of change within your theory, your bigger, messier theory of change. I'm going to play one video for you guys real quick that does a better job than I'll ever be able to do summarizing what a pathway of change is. Theory of change is sometimes called a pathway of change, a road to change. Like I said, it's that image of how we think change will happen. And I'm going to play this 2.5-minute video for you guys that gives a really good example of a theory of change.
So what exactly is the theory of change or impact chain? Well, the theory of change forms the backbone of any social impact measurement system and is massively useful. It's basically a visualization of how the day-to-day activities of an organization relate to their overall mission or long-term goals in terms of outcomes for the areas they work in, and is key in deciding on what exactly should be measured in an organization. Well, that's the theory of it, but how do you actually use it? Let's use our favorite rooftop garden project to get started. If you remember, the Rooftop Garden Project works with people with learning disabilities, providing a space where they learn to garden in groups, giving them a chance to be outside, learn new skills, and to socialise. So how should Teresa, the CEO, go about putting her theory of change down? Well, in practice, it's best to do this activity in a group workshop because you need multiple perspectives to get a complete picture. Get some staff, some trustees, some primary, and even some secondary beneficiaries involved if possible. For Teresa, that means getting group facilitators, gardeners, clients, carers, and parents to come to her workshop. The first thing to do is to get down what the Rooftop Garden Project does on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis that contributes directly to their mission. For the Rooftop Garden Project, these activities are group gardening and training with clients, and social events with clients. The next part is to brainstorm on what exactly these activities bring about in the beneficiaries. Teresa has seen that many clients have lost weight after coming on the programme because of the physical work, and so mentioned improved health as an outcome and weight loss as a medium-term output. A parent mentions that her son's sleep patterns are much better. He doesn't get woken up as much. A facilitator mentions that their clients have improved their fitness levels. So why did these come about? Because of the physical activity which is due to the Rooftop Garden Project running group gardening and training. Another theory of change is that the programme allows better relationships with friends and family. Why? because the client is less likely to throw tantrums and perform other types of antisocial behaviour. Why is that? Because their social skills have improved due to the social nature of group gardening and social events. Also, the clients are more tired after days gardening and are less bored. So there you have two examples of theories of change or impact chains. These both relate to the mission statement because they are providing a more full life for the persons with disabilities, which is part of the mission statement.
Not able to hear you, Chris.
Sorry about that. So thank you. I muted for the video and didn't unmute. So I would suggest that you craft a theory of change for your program as we go through this talk real quick. It's not going to be anything detailed, but it'll be great for your retention of information. And again, I encourage you, if you have any questions, thoughts, or observations, please feel free to participate in the chat as much as you feel called to or interested to. The theory of change that you develop, you can use as a foundation upon which later you can build a logic model or evaluation plan of your own. So what is the theory of change? The theory of change, just to make it a little bit more confusing, is both the process and the product of theory of change. So you would refer to the process of creating a theory of changes as also the theory of change, right? So it's a process and a product. The theory of change is a methodology used for planning, participation, and evaluation. It describes how and why the desired change is expected to happen. It's shocking to see how many programs haven't sat down and captured that fundamental thing besides out of the head of the founder, right? And a theory of change will help you identify solutions that address the underlying and possibly root causes of the problem you chose to address and focus your decision making. A theory of change also helps to identify the assumptions you will need to revisit throughout the process to ensure your decisions will efficiently and effectively contribute to the desired change. A theory of change as a product can support your program in several ways. Most notably, a theory of change is your program's story of how you believe change will unfold. Working on your theory of change will help you be more creative in your thinking, strengthen your effectiveness, provide a solid framework for evaluation, and help you demonstrate the impact you envision. A theory of change can aid in aligning your stakeholders and community to your larger mission and help them understand their role in achieving it. Development is another important area that it benefits. So the theory of change helps you think through your strategy to clarify what you want to achieve, how your program works, and what you need to support it. The first two and very powerful parts of a theory of change, your mission and your problem, like your problem statement and your mission statement together, that's your case for support that many of you are likely familiar with, right? Theory of change is also probably at its most powerful is a consensus building tool. A theory of change can aid in aligning your stakeholders and community to your larger mission and help them understand their role in achieving it. Developing a theory of change builds common understanding among everyone that participates and promotes buy-in. So you would normally involve a cross-section of your stakeholders, both internal and external. Now, often when I do this as a workshop, most of my participants are doing most of the work rather than leading it themselves. So if that's you, once you see the big picture, you'll likely realize you can't achieve your mission by yourself. More commonly, you probably already know that. But when it comes time to lead your stakeholders through the same theory of change process, you may find that you get more traction in a consultative approach. And you might find that you can then take pieces of this when you can visualize the whole picture and hand that off for somebody to own, and that they can be more effective because they see how that piece that they own fits into the larger picture. So I'm going to go through the components of a theory of change with you now. And each of the following components of your theory of change is a precondition of the next. So we kind of work backwards from the flow that you would see in a logic model. Now, by referring to each of your previous components as you develop a new component, you can assure alignment throughout the work that you do. And by now, we all know that makes for a much more powerful organization. Alignment will help you define what matters most and then create a plan to achieve it. Strategic alignment requires analysis and a willingness to reassess and adjust regularly. And the theory of change makes explicit a lot of the things that have existed implicitly for you up until now. So the first step in creating a theory of change is to briefly explain what needs to change. What problems are you working to solve? You want to concisely and precisely articulate the problem your program is trying to solve for the community you serve. This includes the who, what, why, where, and when. And you want to be able to drill down, because the last thing you want to be doing is investing time and resources in solving the symptoms. If you can address the root cause problem, you can have an outsized impact. And so there's a concept called the 5 whys, which is as simple as really just asking why 5 times. And it's the idea is keep drilling down till you can't drill down any further. And you've likely discovered what the root cause issue is. And you want a program that intervenes with the problem as close to that root cause as possible. This ensures you don't waste time or effort addressing symptoms of a deeper issue. So as we go through, you can see that I've included examples from the workshop that I do. Hey, here's the problem statement that we're trying to solve by having this workshop. And there will be one on every page if you want to look at examples. So, what are we trying to accomplish? The answer to this question is the solution to your problem statement. And it's your statement of purpose. In other words, it's your mission. A lot of organizations that I work with, initially, like a lot of the smaller organizations, are often struggling for direction. And it's no surprise because they will have a very generic mission statement, like brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ, something like that. And while that, we do want that spiritual element, we need something specific. We need to have a North Star. We need direction on what we're going to do to change things. So if there's a problem we're gathering to address, there are probably 100 solutions. So a mission statement helps you and your stakeholders identify of all the possible solutions, which one's our solution, right? It articulates your program's priorities and it provides a future direction. It serves as the rock upon which you'll build other elements of your theory of change. Your outcomes, your outputs, activities, and inputs must progressively be in alignment with your mission and each other. So the other common trap beyond something kind of generic is sometimes organizations will summarize their services. So phrase your mission in terms of the impact you want to have over the course of your program, not the work that you want to do, because the work that you want to do should change as trends in your audience changes, but your impact should be something more long-term. Remember, the mission of your program differs from that of your organization if you're doing this for a specific program within a larger organization. So again, you want to avoid having a statement that's too broad or general. Having a clear mission will keep you from implementing a very interesting program that doesn't achieve the impact that you want. And this is the exciting part. For me, outcomes are the heart of the theory of change process. So while your mission may describe a general goal, your vision for a better future, outcomes are the ultimate result of your program. I'm going to go over a couple of slides related to outcomes. Outcomes are the changes for individuals, families, groups, businesses, organizations, or communities, right? Whoever you're impacting, they're the change for your beneficiaries. Some outcomes might be negative and some of them might be unintended, but all outcomes would generally be accepted as valid by your stakeholders. Not all outcomes can be achieved at the same time. So outcomes fall across a spectrum and are typically grouped into short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes. Outcomes might take a year or a decade to achieve, but later outcomes are always going to be dependent on earlier ones. I don't like to phrase them as short, mid, and long term, because I think people then get confused about laying out their outcomes in relation to how long they think they're going to take. And I think that it's usually better to look at them as changes in mind that produce changes in action, that produce changes in society or the community that you serve. So you would generally start with, what long-term outcomes do you hope to eventually see? If you think back to the video I showed you, they started with the big long-term outcome that they're achieving. And then you work backwards and consider, if I want to achieve that outcome, what needs to happen before my long-term outcomes can occur? Those are your midterm outcomes. And finally, what short-term outcomes do you expect to see as an immediate result of your program? And you want to identify, one of the keys to leveraging your theory of change is identifying the connection between all these pieces, right? So you want to separate your outcomes into short-term outcomes you expect to see during delivery of your program, midterm outcomes that you want to see resulting from those. So usually it's changes in mind, education, values, et cetera, producing changes in people's action, behavior, or processes that make the longer-term changes that we're trying to acquire. Your outcomes should be phrased in terms of change. What is the desired effect for who, what, when, where? So one of the things that I often remind participants is, talk about this as if your program is in place and running and successful. Paint that picture for what you're trying to accomplish. And they should be written in the SMART format: specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and timely. Specific targets serve as a goal, but they also require supporting evidence. And if your program is new or rather unique, I would actually caution you to do the opposite, and determining an appropriate target might not be appropriate. Determining an appropriate target might not be appropriate for you and can set up an expectation or something. Even Kenneth, you know, in your experience, you likely think, though, that those times where we say, hey, I might be able to achieve this. I don't know what my expected outcome is, but I think this is a goal I can achieve. 6 months later, when you're meeting with the board, your board has that written in stone. They're saying, you said you were going to achieve that. No, I said that I was going to try, and you made me pick a goal, and I have no idea if this is brand new. And that's what we picked as a direction to head towards. So you'll have to, if you've got a well-developed program, and one with like, if you're looking more at change or optimizing, then you likely have the data to be able to pick reasonable goals. But I caution you not, just from a social engineering standpoint, I caution you not to do that if there's no basis in evidence. They'll cause you more trouble than they will benefit.
Chris, I was on the board of a mid-sized nonprofit for 7 years and was the board chair for 3 years.
So you were the guy holding them to.
Yeah, I was on the other end. I would push them for stretch goals and then be on the other end of, why haven't you accomplished them? They said, well, you made a stretch.
Well, and especially when you've got turnover in boards and changes happen. And in small and medium-sized organizations, you're pivoting 6 times over a year. So in some cases, a benchmark or a number can actually be harmful, but a measurement will always be useful. So you always want to say, hey, we'll measure this by percentage of people that gets you thinking about the objective appropriately without necessarily tying somebody's hands to something that's unachievable. So we're working backwards. We've got our mission. We know, we have this vision for the future that's going to be a better community, better congregation, better world. And now we got to think, well, what do we need to change for that to happen? What needs to happen in that community for that community to change? And those are your long-term outcomes. They are changes in condition. So they will be social, economic, they'll be civic or environmental, but this is the stuff that really gets our heart racing when we think about it. A mission is a great vision, but when we start thinking about what do we want to happen, those are our long-term outcomes. Your work will create the circumstances for these long-term outcomes, but generally you will have less influence on these. It's hard to measure long-term outcomes because often you're one of 100 factors pushing the needle on something like poverty or an environmental issue. Long-term outcomes are often so big that it's hard to separate your impact from all the other factors impacting that outcome. But that's okay. That's to be expected. Where we start seeing a little bit more of what we know we're accomplishing is the midterm outcomes. Midterm outcomes change actions. Those changed actions change the conditions that you're looking to change. Changed actions are changes in behavior, changes in practice, decision-making, or policies. And they link your program short-term outcomes to your long-term outcomes, right? You don't get changes in condition unless a company changes its policy or people change the way they act. And the only way you get those things to change are changes in learning. And whether that's education or whether that, well, it's all, I would say it's all education, but whether that's changes in what, if any of you are teachers or have been teachers, what we call the knowledge domain versus like Bloom's taxonomy versus the affective domain, there are multiple buckets here. Sometimes it's about changing values, and that can sometimes be harder or require a very different intervention than changing people's knowledge or understanding. Sometimes it's just awareness. Like, come with me, you have to see this thing, right? Like some of the best fundraisers, the people that really like hit home for their donors, like, look at what's happened, and then here's a vision of empowerment of what we can achieve. These are the most immediate results of your program. They're the necessary steps towards your mid and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes are the result of your program, but they shouldn't be confused with outputs, which I'll talk about next. Outputs are the direct and measurable products expressed in terms of volume delivered or a level of participation. So if I was really going to quickly summarize the difference between outputs versus outcomes, think of outputs as quantity and outcomes as quality. Or outputs are about efficiency and outcomes are about effectiveness. One is driving numbers and the other is change. So it's possible to become very efficient at doing the wrong things. And we do want to measure efficiency, but we never want to measure efficiency separate from effectiveness. So that's one number. If you're developing a dashboard or starting to think about your evaluation plan, one number that you want to consider is output. So for this workshop, how many of you are on here? If I can count 10 people, but like 3 of us, I think, are staffish. That would be an output. That would be a measure of efficiency. But if I'm talking to 7 of you and all 7 of you go and have an outsized impact on your organization after today, that would drive my outcomes. Versus if I go and do the same presentation to 200 students and none of them use it, that would be great for my outputs. Look how productive Chris is being, but has he moved the needle on change? Probably not. Right? So whenever I do this with participants, I always group activities and outputs, and doing it that way will, kind of reduce confusion. A, it makes outputs distinct from your outcomes, which deserve a lot of attention. And B, your outputs are only a value tied to the activities, right? So an output separate from an activity is useful. Your outputs will be activity specific. So we put out activities and outputs together because they're so closely related. Activities are the actions that are needed to implement your program to achieve your outcomes and your mission. Providing a complete list of activities helps people who are not familiar with your program understand what it takes to implement the change that you're aiming for. Examples of activities include training and teaching, this workshop, right? Assessments, facilitation, service delivery, advocacy, relationship building. And it's helpful to group related activities together because this isn't really a to-do list. We're not trying to identify everything you do. Getting too specific can overwhelm your audience and actually confuse the vision of what you're trying to achieve. One common mistake I see when people are building their theories of change is to include components in their theory of change that you need to start or develop your program. A fundraising plan, teacher training or something like that. If that's an ongoing activity of your program running in its ideal form, then it belongs here as an activity. If it's a task that you need to do once before you launch the program, it's an input. It's something that's required for you to start, but it's not part of your organizational or program activities. So only include activities required to run the program, but include every activity you need to operate it as intended, not just the activities you currently offer. This starts building a vision for people of how you're going to grow, why, what impact that growth is going to have, why you need funding, why you need volunteers. You want everybody to see the vision of what this could be and how this will drive the change, not what's happening right now. Kenneth, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a concrete example of how that was so important recently. I was talking to a potential grant provider of a $25,000 grant. And our initial program that we want to start out with is an after-school program.
I've done work theories of change for a lot of those.
Yeah, and one of the things that they said to me was, boy, this seems like a lot of money. The budget I had submitted was we have a budget for this year of $125,000. They said, this seems like a lot of money for just an after-school program, and I don't know that we want to just support an after-school program. What else do you want to do in the future? Where are you going with this organization? And so starting to envision some of those other programs, we're just starting with an after-school program as the first one, was very important. And I had to resubmit for the grant, and we had not developed this thing that you're talking about of the additional programs that will help us achieve the vision. They liked the vision, but they thought so it was just a concrete example that without doing that, I would not have gotten the $25,000 grant.
Yeah, and so when I think of the impact of the work that I do about this sector development work and the education work, it's often not people like you that benefit the most from this. You guys are getting maybe that last 20%, right? The real Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, is when we manage to find the rural ministries, the small ministries, the small social organizations that could use that haven't even had any exposure to these ideas, and they'll sit down. And often, I've been working with a lot of, my work is both secular and in the spiritual space, and my work in the spiritual space is with 3 denominations in Canada and the US. And when I work with them, we will often get a small congregation come here and say, we need more people. I need butts and seats and I need revenue. Or sometimes I don't even need revenue, but the average age of my congregants is 80 and they're dying. And so I need more people. We've got this church, we've got this money, we don't have people to help out. And, our guy who does this is physically incapable of doing that anymore. So they come to me and say, Chris, I need you to help me recruit more people to the church, right? And one of the first realizations that they often come to when we start exploring problem and mission is that their issue isn't one of people in their seats. Their issue has become one of connection or meaning to their community. And by offering something meaningful to to broaden this beyond the spiritual, by offering something meaningful to their target, they're relevant. And it's that relevance that drives the things that they thought were the problem. So that's why it's so important to recognize the appropriate problem. So in a lot of cases, I've had people come to me and say, well, our neighborhoods become more crime ridden or this or that, and we want to address, and it's amazing how often the solution is an after school program, right? Like when we start looking at the long-term outcomes, what we want is reduced crime, more economic opportunity, etc. And everyone, like I said, there's 100 solutions, which one's yours? Often there's an opportunity to achieve more of those long-term outcomes when we look at programs that will help people in that way. So that's something that doesn't get an immediate benefit. You know, maybe grades go up, but that might be a little bit hard to measure if you're not the teacher or you're not partnered with them. But, you know, 5 years down the road, people are valuing education. People aren't doing, you know, are doing more positive activities than negative. Long term is that economic benefit, right? That higher self-worth, et cetera. There's these cascades. And that's what your outcomes is about, is let's separate those out. And often it's if I can change their minds, if I can educate them, change their values about education, get them to value math over wandering around with my friends, right? That leads to those changes in behavior that you want, that lead to the changes in conditions that you want. But you have to figure out what you're going to do to change that, right? So outputs are the measurable, concrete, and direct results of your program's activities. They represent engagement with or acceptance of your activities. They qualify the size or scope of your activities. Outputs, as I said, are a measure of quantity, not quality. And they're not the changes you expect the program to produce. They indicate if an activity was delivered to the attended population in the attended amount. So they're just a reality check of if your activities are operating the way that they're intended to, not if you have the right activities. Your outcomes tell you if you have the right activities. And the other reason why I think there's value in grouping your outputs with your activities is your outcomes aren't going to change very quickly. Your mission will never change. The only organization, there's 30,000 organizations here in Canada. The only organization that ever changed their focus was March of Dimes, because they eliminated polio. So March of Dimes found another mission. Nobody else has ever in that way accomplished their mission. So missions are static. Outcomes change slowly, if ever, in over long periods, but activities are going to change all the time, right? If there's a new trend, think about how communication happened in the nonprofit world before social media versus after, right? Think about the impact email had. And what did that change to your needed input? Suddenly you needed graphic designers and web designers and such, right? So your activities will change, or like your tactics, they will change as conditions change, as your audience changes, as trends change, as any of your assumptions change. Your outcomes will hardly change and your mission will almost never change. If you've done the research, if your problem and mission are evidence-based, those are gonna, like if you have a strong case for support, those are pretty set in stone. Right? Now, the underlying factors that are important to recognize, your assumptions underlie much of the work that you do, but are often minimized or overlooked, right? When we set one goal and we don't achieve it, if we haven't identified that that's because like we've achieved it for 5 years and all of a sudden, you know, it dropped 80%. We don't know why. It's not it may not be your staff's fault. It might be that one of your major assumptions has changed, and that's going to require transformative change for your organization. So it's really important that that you capture these. These are things that are accepted as certain to happen, but they might not. So what are the characteristics, needs, and priorities of the population you want to serve? If that population changes, or any of the, maybe the demographics, the psychographics, if their needs change. Think about what COVID has done, right? In that, like, a lot of the assumptions about how we deliver programs has changed. And if we can recognize how those assumptions change, then we're better able to adapt our activities, right? And then other assumptions might be what will facilitate or be a barrier to serving our audience. The theory of change helps us recognize these assumptions, because when not recognized, these factors can cause confusion or hinder success. You have to take your assumptions seriously, and any changes in your assumption will call for changes to your program, or at the very least, a re-examination of it. By identifying and communicating assumptions to your stakeholders, you'll be better able to explain unanticipated outcomes. So it's worth taking some time to review the categories I've got here and consider whether there are any specific contextual factors that affect your program. Causality factors are like what leads to what and how. So the connection between pieces, how your mission addresses the problem you identified, how effectively each stage of your theory of change connects to or achieves the previous stage, or even just how your recipients learn, behave, or get motivated. Implementation factors are how your program is designed and targeted. So that might be your operations, access to resources that you have, organizational capacity, the role of others in providing the solution, your partnerships, a lot of pieces that your volunteers, pieces that you don't necessarily have control of. And then external factors, assumptions about the influence of issues outside your area of work. So think back to your strategic plans, right? Like your PESTLE or PEST analysis, that has a part here in terms of capturing it for your assumptions, right? Assumptions are not the things that will result from your program. They are things that already exist, but are not within your control. They might be unique to just your program or your community. So when developing your theory of change, it is necessary to validate your assumptions against available evidence and the perspective of multiple stakeholders. If you're fortunate, when you sit on a board, you sit on a board with a cross-section of stakeholders, the beneficiaries, the donors, the institutions, the partners. You have a staff member present in terms of the executive director. So sometimes this stuff is easier when you've already built that cross-section and everyone has a voice. If not, then you're looking at a concerted effort every time that you do this, because this is meant to be a collaborative activity. And where possible, your assumptions should be based on research, right? And if not, then experience and best practices. And then finally, inputs are the resources that are required to deliver your activities. Inputs might be human resources, financial resources, it might be the facilities themselves, technology or equipment, or materials, right? Like your activities, you want to be specific with your inputs on what resources you need, but don't spend too much time making an itemized list. This isn't a shopping list. You just want to make sure you also include often forgotten resources such as technology, materials, and space. And then you want to look at the whole picture, and are the inputs sufficient or suitable to deliver the activities as you set them out? And then are they attainable or feasible? Not necessarily tomorrow, but having this completed theory of change, showing somebody how money or time in produces a change in society, makes filling your input needs that much easier. Kenneth, in the example you provided, I found that when I ran a small organization, and after we completed a theory of change, and this is what drove me to become someone who advocates for this, pretty much all of our potential funders or previous funders, as I shared it with them and communicated, were excited to jump on board, right? I got more money than I needed. I got more volunteers than I needed. Understanding the picture was something that got people that wanted to be part of it, right? So let's bring it all together. You want to combine these various sections of your theory of change. Some keys to doing that successfully. First and foremost, before anything else, a theory of change should be consultative. It's not feasible for me in 1 hour to lead you through this consultative process. So my hope was that you might make notes and map out a very, very rough one. But I have a lot of people who are interested in facilitating this in their communities. And what they do is they come and do the workshop with me. And in the workshop, I have them do one to learn it. And then they go back and they do a whole nother one from scratch. Because essentially, if there's any meaningful difference of the problem and mission when you start talking to your stakeholders. 1 degree difference at the beginning takes you to a very different place as you go through the iterative steps. So the theory of change that they develop is useful as a roadmap and to make sure that there aren't any speed bumps on the road that they're traveling with their stakeholders, but seldom do they apply it. It's often useful maybe if there's a loss of momentum or something to keep some forward movement. But really, the first time that you develop one, I often suggest people develop one on their own, just to get a sense of and understand it before they facilitate. The development of a theory of change also offers an opportunity to engage your stakeholders in a discussion and build consensus around the problem you're trying to address in a way that may have never been done before. Stakeholders might include partners, funders, board members, staff, volunteers, and hopefully definitely include the beneficiaries of your product or service, right? You'll be able to employ the breadth and depth of all that knowledge that stakeholders hold and find more workable, efficient, and sustainable solutions. This is the sort of thing, this consultative aspect, that drives transformative change for organizations, right? Another one, you guys, from what I know so far, seem like an experienced bunch, so I maybe don't have to tell you this, but theory of change as a strategic framework requires alignment. Each step needs to be in progressive alignment. And if your organization's alignment is unclear to staff or volunteers, they might lose faith in your mission. So by ensuring that you have alignment in your theory of change, you can be certain that none of your limited resources go to waste. It's not very complicated when I say that, to put it on paper and say just align it, easy, right? But in practice, it's actually very hard to get right, because often maybe we don't articulate it in the right detail. Maybe we haven't fully parsed through the connection between pieces. Of course, it has to be credible. It should be based on and revised against evidence and best practice at every stage and every conversation. And you want to validate everything that you do as you go, as you're able to. But you want to make sure, for example, that your analysis is sound and your assumptions are accurate. And then, and this is the key, and this is why you're here, a theory of change should be evaluative. By validating your theory of change, you can conclude that your program has made a difference. Your theory of change is useful for identifying the data that needs to be collected and how it should be analyzed. The big challenge I see around evaluation and why the theory of change, though we haven't talked numbers, is such an important part of evaluation, is most things that get evaluated are the things that we measure already, right? We tend to evaluate against what's easy to evaluate, and we should be evaluating against what's meaningful. And the other thing is, if I hired Rick to do evaluation for my organization, Rick could make that an hour-a-week job, a 60-hour-a-week job, and still not be done all the evaluation that's possible. Evaluation is infinite, and we want to make it finite. And also, we don't want the risk of collecting data that you don't need and that maybe something happens to that data. So we want to minimize what we collect to just what we need. And a theory of change identifies exactly what you need. What do you need to evaluate to confirm that you're achieving your outcomes, right? That's a really big one. And that might be longer term, right? So if I'm doing a workshop, I can measure my outcomes very easily. Who attended, how often, what was their age, et cetera. I can do a survey. To measure an outcome related to learning, it's as easy as doing a survey at the beginning and the end. What did you know about this? What did you think about this? And then afterwards, see if you changed their mind. And then 3 months from now, test your midterm outcomes. Did you change your behaviors? Right? And like I said, you probably will have difficulty measuring your long-term outcomes. Are there any questions? This would be a good place for me to stop and check in on you guys. Thoughts, comments, beauty tips? Okay, we have a little bit of extra time, so I have an extra piece that I've put in here. So we'll jump into that. And again, at any point, if you have any questions, you're welcome to jump into the chat. So you've outlined your theory of change. You've completed it. You're a genius. You've somehow, from a 1 hour talk, being able to put together this complex document. How do you share it with people, right? You're not going to take that scriggly piece of paper and be like, here it is, read this, get back to me. Your theory of change identifies the connections between your stakeholders, the activities, the outside factors to determine what approaches will best accomplish your mission. Your logic model will focus on the connections that are relevant to your activities to show the intended relationship between investment and results. It's a slimmed down activity focused document, whereas your theory of change is big and messy and is focused around the outcomes and attitudes and the conditions and such, right? Without a theory of change to guide your logic model, most of us are probably familiar with logic models. If you've run a nonprofit and ever gone after the United Way funding, they've been huge proponents since the 50s of logic models. And by your second or third year of receiving funding from them, they suggest it to you. And by your fifth year, they demand that you have a logic model outlining what you do. But without a theory of change to guide your logic model, you might become very efficient at solving the wrong problems. So a logic model grounded in a theory of change provides a focus that you can use for your evaluation plan. A logic model is a visual representation that shows the relationship between those same components, the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, to display how and why a set of activities will change short-term, mid-term, and long-term impact, right? So again, centered on the activities forward, whereas you're working backwards with a theory of change from your mission, right? So documenting your theory of change in this way can support program management, because it can be a basis for developing a more detailed management plan. It can support performance management, right? It'll help you improve performance through iterative decision making by helping you isolate choices and monitor their results, right? Most organizations benefit from bringing accountability, and counterintuitively to most people, they actually tend to benefit and enjoy a degree of accountability. Giving them the right metrics and the ability to perform against them is usually quite fulfilling for people. It's useful for communication. It's hard to communicate a whole big, messy theory of change, but a logic model is an easy way to illustrate to your stakeholders what your program does, your activities, and how that links to what it achieves, your outcomes. Right? And then fundraising. A sound logic model demonstrates to funders that you know what resources you need, what programs will do, and what you will accomplish. It also helps structure grant writing. Most funders and organizations require logic models. At the very least, you will find fundraising a lot easier with one, right? They don't want to read 20 pages. They want to look at a picture at a glance and get an understanding that way, right? So you're likely, like Kenneth, we think of your example, you're not often asking for funds for the whole organization. You're likely asking for funds for a particular program, because that's the area of interest, the stated area of interest of that funder, right? So you want to include the full picture of the intended program in its ideal form again, right? But that's why we might leave out other moving pieces that are only a small part of this within the organization. So a logic model is an effective way to describe a program and a theory of change for it scales really well for small or large organizations. If your program is small or a pilot project, your logic model might incorporate the whole program or organization. And if it's larger, I've often seen organizations that will say, hey, we actually have kind of 3 pillars of what we do. Let's develop logic models for each of the pillars, right? And then you want to, well, all I've outlined here is you want to consider who your audience is. And you might develop logic models in different ways depending on the needs of that audience, the cycle, the season, what's happening, right? Because again, this is just a piece of the bigger picture. But your final product, that final logic model makes duplicating your ministry or program or organization much easier and may be required by funders. Many different logic model formats exist. I use this really simple template because I don't want the medium to become the message. But I've got examples from other organizations that look like this, right? Or they look like this. So really, you can get very creative in how you visualize your theory of change, right? One of the best things about the logic model, though, it allows you to visualize that causal nature of your theory of change. And by making those connections explicit, by attaching arrows like we saw in the video, not only do you get to assess the strength of the connection, those connections themselves become your evaluation plan, right? So you work a theory of change to a logic model. A logic model helps you very quickly identify, because your evaluation plan should really be evaluating the connection between the various pieces. So next steps, go build consensus with your stakeholders about what your intended outcomes are. Communicate with your funders about your achievements and why you need inputs and how they fit into that bigger picture. Communicate your insights from going through a process like this with everybody that will listen, right? And most importantly, take that theory of change, develop a logic model, and that logic model can be the center of a well-considered and developed evaluation plan that you work on. So we got through, we even achieved my stretch goal, Kenneth. All right, we got through the extra material I had, and I'll send a copy of this deck out to you guys through Sent. That's my email there. If you want to screen capture it, write it down, or anything like that, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'll take questions now, and by sending this out to you, it'll include a few links. It'll include a link to that 5 whys technique that I told you about, a worksheet to help you develop SMART goals, which will be an important part of your outcomes, which to me are the heart of the theory of change, and then some templates and some instructions on how you can do a logic model and how you can build an evaluation framework based on that logic model. Last chance for questions, guys. I'd love to hear someone else speak.
Oh,
Do you have one, Kenneth?
the only thing is I jumped on at the end, so I guess I could do this via your email, but do you do this for a living? So can I, if I wanted to, can I contract with you to help me with this?
Yeah, so the bigger picture of my practice is around change management, organizational and workforce transformation, but specifically, this is kind of my love, and this is what I see as my kind of the legacy I want to leave is an improved sector for us. So I do work, I deliver workshops, and I do consulting. The consulting is a facilitation. So if that was something you're interested in, we would scope that, right? In terms of how much of the consultative portion, the gathering, the feedback from your stakeholders and such, do you want to do versus me? Because you can do that at a reduced cost and you have those relationships. One of the more popular ways that I do that, and that any of you guys can do if you're familiar with theory of change, is we put together a series of stakeholder meetings. So you arrange the cross-section of your stakeholders, and we do 2 8-hour intensives or something like that. So it would really depend on your needs, but you're welcome to email me, and it would be a consultative approach. So I'd ask you a bunch of questions and we would co-create what that might look like. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you.
Was there anybody else that had any questions? Or even just wanted to share experience? Pedro?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Just working? Okay. I'm not sure if it's sort of a comment combined with question.
Sure.
First, thank you. This is just a part of it is I'm struggling to articulate what I want to say.
It's a bit like drinking from the fire hose for me to teach you something that should be, 20, 30 hours in 1 hour. If it even made sense to you, that's an accomplishment on your part.
I'm definitely going to have to rewatch, but it's just been incredibly helpful. And there were touching on several pieces that I was like, yes.
I'm glad. Well, I'll make sure you get a copy of this, okay?
But the question, I guess, is, and I guess this is sometimes what I struggle with, this kind of, learning a model or learning a way of, putting my idea, my vision, and making it tangible and putting it into action. Is like, how long did you spend learning this process, this model, versus, the time, like how much is that's taking you from actually doing the grind?
So doing the work is always going to take more time than learning the concept. So here we're learning one framework, but applying it's a fair amount of work. And the biggest amount of that work is that consultative approach. You guys, every hour you put up into it at a certain up until a certain point is going to have outsized impact, exponential results. Like for a lot, there are a couple of different formats of workshop that I do, and they range anywhere from 15 to 30 hours, but are usually a really good investment of time, because the people that I've had people like Kenneth who are board members, and they go, every board meeting we go to now, I can't help but look at everything through the lens of this framework. So the theory of change is not the thing that transforms anything, right? All it really is a lens for you. It's those conversations, it's the work. I could teach you 12 other frameworks that might be useful for you around strategy and organizational development and such. And every one of them would have an impact, and a permanent one, by changing you for the better. But if there were one that I was gonna apply organizationally, I would say this is the one. Before you learn anything else like Diamond D and pest analysis and stuff like that, this is the one, because first and foremost, what am I trying to change and how am I going to do that? If you can answer those questions, a lot of the other problems that other frameworks address, 80% of them just dematerialize, because people will naturally start making decisions about their piece with an understanding of the bigger picture. Thanks for your question. Great question.
Thank you, Chris. We're at time. I want to give people adequate time to move to the next space. But again, thank you for this framework, this insight that you've shared that I believe will be helpful to all those who are imagining and working through their own particular projects. I want to clarify one thing, because I know some people may have went to the other workshop. So the information that the 5 whys and the worksheets, will they be sent to us to put in Hoover, or can you put them in Hoover versus having to request them?
I might send them to Ashley and ask for help.
Okay, cool. I thought you were a Hoover expert.
I'll try. I'll give Hoover a look and see if I can get it, but I want to make sure it gets someplace where everyone will see it and have access to it.
Okay.
Darnell, I would love if you could also email it to the people who are here, if you're able to do that.
Certainly.
So that it gets into the hands of everybody here specifically.
Okay, so just put me an email as well, me and Ashley. We'll get that.
I will. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.
Take care.